empowerment. I finally made it. I finally got my in. There's a lot of benefits that were in the tech industry. I was super, super pleased. I did, in order to gain anything that's useful in life, you got to risk a little bit. The jump is always scary, but you got to kind of just push through that.
In today's episode, we have Vic, who is a senior developer at Sublime Media, which is an e-learning company that serves Fortune 500 clients, and an instructor at Camp, which is a coding bootcamp. Welcome to the show, Vic.
Hi.
So you initially pursued computer forensics, which sounds very cool, in college, but actually found it emotionally challenging, and then later transitioned to web development. Can you tell us more about what is computer forensics? What did you find that was challenging about it?
So computer forensics is the stuff that I studied is defragging hard drives, kind of taking a look at hash values of files that were deleted or erased. There's always a little bit of a lingering data there. So essentially very criminal driven in terms of stuff, so very dark web, dealing with data management, social security number leaks, things like that. And so that's why I found it emotionally challenging. I found it morally conflicting because it was kind of a heavy subject. But I found that it was I wanted more of a creative aspect in my role. And so that was a pretty quick thing for me to kind of change and shift. So my computer science degree is this generic computer science degree, computer information system. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I got a bunch of certifications. It started off with hardware support, desktop support, and then I got kind of another certificate in server management and managing Active Directory. And during those courses, I studied Java, and I kind of had a little bit of a liking towards Java. I was kind of in this a weird shift of, well, I know I want to get into the tech industry. I know that it's going to propel and it's going to be really big in the future. I just don't know what I want to do. During that time, I was working at a company called Philip J. Bourne. I was the IT specialist. I did anything from resetting networks or creating subnets, making sure that machines had specific permissions. If anything were to fail, like a hard drive or a backup issue, I'd have to address that. I quickly realized that I was kind of at will with everybody else's ask. And so because of that, I kind of wanted a role that I could move freely. I found out about Sublime Media because there was a buddy of mine in college that we were going through classes together, and we were really successful. We had presentations and assignments, and they were super successful. He had already worked at Sublime Media, and so I kind of already had this in. And so I ended up going to the interview, and I totally felt like I bombed the interview. And they asked me all the technical questions, and I didn't really know what front end was. I kind of looked it up on Google and did some searches there, but I was really dipping in. And so I'm kind of this hybrid self-taught coder / bootcamp. The reason why I went to a bootcamp after the fact was because I wanted to learn React.js. I was kind of digging into Bootstrap 3 at the time and the shift of modular component library. And so I found that React was really, really interesting to me, and I wanted to learn more about that. And so that's why I ended up going to the bootcamp.
So when you were making this transition yourself, you mentioned that it wasn't easy, right? You had a lot of imposter syndrome, which I think a lot of people do, especially earlier on in their career. And you not only had to develop more of the coding skills when you want to become a web developer, but also the people skills that come along with it. Tell us more about what did the imposter syndrome feel like? How did it manifest itself?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I was hired at Sublime and they asked me what I can and can't do, I had to teach myself a lot. Specifically at the time, it was Bootstrap 3. And I remember long nights at work pulling my hair out, trying to figure out how to move this object or how to change this shape. And I really recognized that, boot camp, there's the value, right? Is having the ability to educate yourself deeper. So I went to the boot camp and was able to pick up the skills that I needed. But one thing that I realized was that this community-based perspective, I think I could teach a lot better as well. And so because of that, I identified the areas or the criteria of where there was opportunities within the boot camp and became a teacher. And so that's how I became an instructor with that. And so because of that, I kind of erased that imposter syndrome, which was that making that drive or making that shift into the boot camp. In order to gain anything that's useful in life, you got to risk a little bit, right? And so it feels scary at first. The jump is always scary, but you got to kind of just push through that.
Was there ever a time, or maybe when was there a time where the imposter syndrome came the closest to getting you to maybe decide to change course and maybe think to yourself like, this might not be for me? When did it come the closest?
Right in the beginning of my career, when I was trying to self teach, that was the time where I was like, is this the right thing for me? I think trying to leverage that value aspect. And what I did in my organization was that exact same thing. What I found was that I had a lot more attention. I got a lot more attention from my peers because of that. But there was this kind of hurdle where once it clicked, it clicked. And when it did finally click, it was more so about acknowledging that I don't know it all, right? Acknowledging that it's okay to not know it all. It's okay to not know every little piece about code, right? Because as a front end guy working with Vue.js mainly, there's, 40 libraries. And so because of that, you have to have those research skills, right? And you have to have the ability to dig around and scour through the internet and find those answers because the people that are asking for those solutions expect solutions. And so ask for help when you need help, but to try to figure it out for like 20, 30 minutes. And if you're hammering at it and you need some assistance, then you can reach out to your peers.
Yeah, I think it's important that it's just one thing not to know, but it's another to like keep on trying to keep a facade of not knowing. I think that is what
Mhm.
amplifies their imposter syndrome. 'Cause I think what imposter syndrome is like this fear of like being found out. So if you're
Mhm.
transparent from the get-go that you don't know or that you're not expecting yourself to know everything, then there's nothing to find out, right? It's you're transparent that you don't know. So there's the fear of getting caught is kind of gone in that sense. I mean, given that you teach at New Camp and that you are working with people trying to get their first jobs. I'm sure you see this all the time. You mentioned that there's this imposter syndrome that they have too. Is it different than the kind that you experience? Like what particular doubts do you see manifest for people self-teaching, whether that means going to a boot camp and studying that way or studying completely on their own?
I feel like that my imposter syndrome was pretty familiar with those. I think mainly what I see with imposter syndrome is not knowing enough, right? We have to recognize that boot camps are minimized school. There's a lot of information that's compact and shoved into a few weeks. People have this idea that they're going to go to this boot camp and they're going to come out of this boot camp and have all the necessary skills. And then they hit the job market. And that's what creates that imposter syndrome, in my opinion, a lot of the times is that you quickly realize that there's other things that you need to understand. And so being upfront with these guys and letting them know, I always, always, always relate the everyday work stuff that I do into my classes. So then that way there's a little bit more understanding about what they're going up against. I mean, people choose boot camps because it's cheap in comparison to college. So there's got to be a give somewhere, right? And so that's going to be that all that data in those weeks, all that learning.
Hey, hope you're enjoying this episode. Just wanted to hop in real quick and let you know that if you want to learn more from Vic and from this interview, we put together a resource kit that details the resources that Vic recommends, his step by step to get to where he's at today, interview transcripts, a summary slash cliff notes of this video, tips and advice on getting your first job, and all of that is for free. All you have to do is sign up for the email list that's in the description of this YouTube video. And that's it. Back to the interview. So I kind of want to go back to a time where you were first looking to break into the industry, and you share a story with us about a job interview where you initially thought you had failed, but then were later offered the position. Tell us more about that. Like, did you actually fail and they changed their mind? Like, what made you think that you had failed to get this position?
Yeah, absolutely. So because of imposter syndrome, I walked away and told myself I failed. I walked out of that interview and just was very, very deflated. The interview itself wasn't that terrible until we got to the technical JavaScript questions because I wasn't really good with JavaScript at the time. I remember the owner coming in, he asked me one question, and it was such a silly question. He says, what do you do when you don't know how to do something? Like, what's your process? How do you address that? And I told him I Google it. And I thought to myself, what a silly answer, right? Like, of course, every developer would say that. But I was very transparent. I said, hey, if I don't know something, obviously I try to tap into the research skills and I look for it. But thinking about that in retrospect after the interview, I was like, what a terrible answer. And so I had thought to myself, I was like, I totally bombed the interview. I didn't call back. I shot my shot and it was not a very good answer.
So what was it about it that you think, or maybe did they tell you about why they hired you specifically?
The reason why they hired me specifically is because when I interviewed, I created a presentation about how I was going to create a team dynamic to make their team better. And that's going to be because of the teaching aspect that I really, really heavily passionate about independent development. And so what I would do is I would go in the interview, and this was more the soft skill side of the interview, and I would ask them, what would they like to see in a year in terms of the team? How are they going to measure that progression? And what is the end goal there? And it almost felt like that I was kind of interviewing them about their development team. And I think that that's what really jived with those folks was that I was really invested in not only myself, but I was invested in elevating everyone around me. Because at the end of the day, if you have a team that's elevated, it's just going to produce much more efficiently and much better. And because of that, I think that that was kind of the winner aspect of the interview.
Yeah, going back to the point that we made earlier about how the job is more than just technical skills, I think that also applies to these interviews where presentation is not something that I've ever seen someone come prepared to give as someone that interviews people. And I think for companies that don't have these very strict interview processes, you have a lot more runway to stand out and demonstrate things beyond the technical skills. 'Cause I think a lot of companies that hire through very kind of strict processes where they have specific rounds and it's like leak code and it's very focused on
Hmm.
assessing, they have like behavioral rounds and everything like that too. But let's be honest, most of a lot of these companies that have these strict processes, it's a make or break if you don't solve the technical problems that they put in front of you. But for companies that don't have these strict interview processes, there's a little bit more runway, a little more wiggle room to stand out. I think it's important to lean into things that are not necessarily technical, like you mentioned about proving beyond just your particular lane of work, but improving your coworkers as well. So, given that you are someone that helps people with their job hunts post boot camp, is that something you recommend that people do too? Like, what is the right angle between how personalized you approach each interview versus like a numbers game where you're just trying to shoot off resumes and like bang out as many interviews as possible?
Yeah, I definitely talk to the students about the difference between working in a big company and a small company, and even down to the niche of working per se for the government versus working for private sector, because they're completely different things. You've got way more strict parameters when you're working with government, even with big companies. We'll just use Microsoft for an example, right? They have teams of thousands of developers and each individual person is responsible for very, very specific things. And the reasoning behind that is data protection, making sure that that individual doesn't destroy the code base, right? So, in terms of small business, it's much different. You get a little bit more power to make big decisions. You kind of get a little bit more freedom, in my opinion, as a junior dev to really kind of just dig into things. So, first and foremost, I got to let my students know those two things because applying to jobs is going to be two different lanes in that aspect when you get an interview. You're going to see more of those hacker rank, leak code kind of aspect with the bigger companies versus the smaller ones. And you're going to see kind of more of this more casual interview, in my opinion, with those smaller businesses. And I think the reason behind that is because these small businesses, they kind of don't know all the time what they need right away. They're looking for or testing the market to bring you in and use your expertise.
That makes sense. So another interesting thing is that after having the skill set of becoming a software engineer and learning all the skills involved in that, you mentioned to us that there is a lot of potential in this industry, in this job for multiple income streams. Can you share more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. As a senior developer, I own a business, a consulting agency called Code Vibes Consulting. That's a thing that I created for myself after I started doing websites for people. being able to work from home obviously creates more time in the day, right? You don't have to commute. There's this kind of mental energy where you kind of check in for work and you check out for work and you've got to kind of decompress. If you kind of get that time out of the way, you can use that time for other things. For me, using it that time for the instructor role. So any financial manager in today's modern society is going to tell you the way to financial freedom is by having multiple streams of income and or income that is able to produce itself or run by itself. So in the consulting aspect with my private client, that software as a service, that keeping up with the client's demands if they want to shift things around, that's that kind of income that's reoccurring monthly in addition to my regular role. In terms of the instructor aspect, I'm actually what is called a 1099 contractor. So I'm my own business. I pay my own taxes and all that stuff. I work 4 hours on Saturdays to teach a class. I do some grading through the assignment. But the way that I leverage the multiple aspect is because I'm online right now. So I can help students, but I can do my job at the same time. In my company, they're pretty flexible. You're not logged into a VPN. You're not tracked by minute of what you're doing. And I think that aspect in the job market is just shifting away from that. As opposed to clocking in with a time card and clocking out, I think people are trying to find that more value is when you can get the work done as long as it's done on time, right? And so having flexibility, the ability to work from home and things like that gives you the opportunity to create multiple streams of income.
Yeah, I think for listeners that are seeing software engineering as a path to financial freedom, I think really will resonate with that answer. And I think they might be interested in starting their own consulting agency as well. I think the one big challenge, though, that they might not be aware of is that, again, the technical skills of getting the job done is only one piece of it. A lot harder is finding customers, managing them, making sure they're happy, making sure that they pay you. So a lot of this is beyond just understanding how to code. So maybe we'll start there. Like if someone out there were to start their own agency, how do you recommend they even find clients to begin with?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of my clients are word of mouth. It's people that I've met with at boot camps. It's people that I've met with that are locally. During the pandemic, in order to get my name out there, what I chose to do was do some free work. I gave back to the community. I asked small business owners that had not very pretty websites and say, hey, if you give me the opportunity to let me build a thing for you, and put my name as a stamp and share it with anybody that you know, then I'll do it for free. And so in that aspect, there's a little downturn. You're going to have to utilize some of the free time, but it is really important because it kind of puts your name out there. A lot of people are trying to start businesses, but they don't know what they. And so in that aspect, it's really important. I think for people that are just starting out, you can reach out to your friends and your family. You can reach out to anybody that owns a small business. Maybe it's an Etsy shop, maybe it's some kind of small product, and you can utilize that as a marketing tactic for you. And then you can get a little bit bigger in that.
Streams, you mentioned your day job, you mentioned teaching, and then also your agency. Can you share more about your income trajectory from your maybe your first jobs out of college to today?
The first job that I got, it was $24 an hour at the time, 48,000 a year. And that was as a junior dev. And that was kind of a little bit on the low end, in my opinion. And the reason why it was on the low end was because I was upfront and honest about the lack of experience. And so I think that was probably a big indicator of why I was being hired. Um, it's always nice to have a younger aspiring developer because you can mold them for your business as opposed to someone that kind of comes in and tries to change things. So I think, just being honest and saying, hey, we're in it to make a lot more money, but you got to start somewhere. And so getting that foot in the door is really important. You may or may not need to make a little less money. But I'll say for trajectory wise, within the first 3 years of being a junior developer, I quadrupled my salary. So, I mean, we went from 40,000 to about 140,000. And during that time, the tech market was ramping up. So I'll be honest, the salaries were a little bloated because there was a lot of demand and not a lot of supply. When that kind of scenario happened, you'll see kind of those salaries get bloated. Nowadays, it's kind of dwindling down. I would say for a front end engineer, you're going to be looking at anywhere between 75 to 110,000.
I mean, which is so amazing, especially for all the flexibility that comes with it. And you mentioned some things on the show already about the flexibility to work from home, but there's more to it than that. Some of the benefits that you told us where you have Fridays off and unlimited PTO. Do you remember what it was like to get that first job where you had that kind of flexibility, the benefits and the larger income? Like, what was the feeling when that job offer landed in your on a phone call or email? What was your reaction?
Empowerment. I finally made it. I finally got my in. There's a lot of benefits that were in the tech industry. I did not realize how many. And, there's a lot of caveats with those benefits too, because people that aren't self motivated may or may not fall behind. Having all that freedom and having all that flexibility, you have to be able to manage your time effectively. You have to be able to prioritize your tasks effectively. And so things like strategizing how you're going to go through your day, whether it's simply making a list or leveraging probability aspect of like what's more important and what's not as important in order to get done. I think that's super important. But when I first got hired and I finally got through the door, I was super, super pleased. I felt like I finally made it. And then I quickly realized within the first month of my role that we're just getting started, right? That we've got a lot more to learn. So I think being cognitive right from the jump, there's new things every single day that you have to learn. And just recognizing that life is a learning journey. You have to be a sponge in order to stay competitive and in order to stay valuable. And so being upfront with yourself first and foremost and saying, hey, this is just the beginning and we're getting started is super important to your success.
Yeah, I think that's like the theme that I'm hearing, which is that being transparent with yourself is kind of the first starting point. Everyone has goals, big goals that they achieve, but it's not going to be done overnight. Going to boot camp is not going to all of a sudden propel your career to new levels. After you get that first job is not the end either. That's just the beginning of another path. So basically never ends. And I'll leave you with this kind of last question. What's next for you? You're obviously very ambitious. You're doing a bunch of different things. Like what is the goal for the next couple of years?
I would really like to move into the company owner's role, which is a technical director. He does not only the coding aspect, but he manages the entire business, the web servers, all those other. So I think there's a couple of really important skills in order for you to become someone that is of that velocity and that collaboration with cross-functional team, communication styles with cross-functional teams, project management, which is something that developers don't really talk about as much, working with different project management styles, agile methodologies, things like that. So I think moving to my next shift, I would like to become that technical director. There's a lot of learning involved with that too. But I think from there, that's the end of the line. I'm currently 35 years old, so I'm really thinking about the future personally with retirement and pensions and things like that. And so that's going to be that driving force is thinking about how I'm going to be able to get out of that kind of market at 65, hopefully.
Yeah, that's a question that I think not a lot of career paths can answer, right? They might work until the end of their life. So I think it's a blessing to be in a career path that you can pause and think about how do I want to drive out the rest of my career. Thank you so much for your time, Vic. Thanks for coming on and sharing your journey, your advice, and experience with us.
Yeah, absolutely.